Support for Designed By comes from generous donations from listeners like you. Visit aidesigncorps.org/donate.
So my alternative is AI for president. Let's have like a third-party candidate, which is an AI model that takes in all the data. We agree, right? Like, you know, based on like, again, things that we agree the government is for, you know, like public safety, you know, national security, you know, and economic well-being. And then have AI decide like, what are the possibilities? Like that's my solution, because why are we not using the most powerful tool that we have that is here? Like it's like literally emerged for this moment right now when we can't get ourselves out of this pickle and we're not even thinking about using it.
Scanning all frequencies. Hello.
Welcome to Designed By, the nexus where design meets visionary leadership. I couldn't be more excited to introduce you to my friend and fellow visioneer, Tatyana Mamut. Tatyana is a figure who is synonymous with transformative leadership in the Silicon Valley. Her journey is a testament to our mantra, designing our world, whether in government, business, or our personal lives, is the ultimate act of leadership. It's about making intentional choices, never leaving life to chance. Tatyana is a renowned leader, celebrated for her deep customer understanding and empathetic leadership style. Her impressive tenure includes roles at Amazon, Salesforce, Nextdoor, IDEO, and Pendo. Her deep expertise in cultural anthropology and economics, combined with her experience across global markets, underpins her unique approach to product design and leadership. On my walks with Tatyana in the Noe Valley, I discovered Tatyana's story is one of resilience, innovation, and belief that empathy and understanding are the cornerstones of transformative leadership. Tatyana, I believe everyone has a story, and everyone's story matters. So, my friend, where does your story begin?
I was born in Kharkiv in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, which is now one of the cities that's been, you know, pretty much destroyed by the Russian army. And my family was half Jewish, half Russian ethnically, and that was an ethnic designation that was on our passports. So Judaism was not a religion so much as an ethnicity and a nationality. In the Soviet Union, my grandfather, my father's father, was imprisoned under Stalin in large part for, you know, being Jewish and being a little too successful as a Jewish person in the Soviet Union. And when the United States and the Soviet Union created a diplomatic agreement to start letting Soviet Jews out of the country, he was one of the first people on the list, frankly, because the Soviet Union didn't want him. And my father and my aunt were blacklisted. They were on a list where they could never go to a top university, could never get a top job, and could never get their own apartment in the Soviet Union because of their, you know, nationality of being Jewish and being related to this person who had been persecuted, politically persecuted under Stalin. So they got out. They were as political refugees. My grandfather, my grandmother, my aunt first left, and my family stayed behind because of my mother's side of the family. Her mother was a very high-powered, high-ranked engineer in the Soviet Union. So she was actually a member of the Communist Party. So there were a whole bunch of problems that could have happened if we tried to go with them. So we decided to stay behind. And my grandfather was, you know, at the border in Austria. They made a decision, go to Israel or go to New York. And they decided to go to New York. And then my family followed them a few years later. And when I look at the world today, and I I feel that I am the luckiest person alive. Frankly, I am so incredibly blessed to be where I am, to not be hiding in a basement in Kharkiv in Ukraine, to not be also hiding in my bomb shelter in Tel Aviv. That what is very present in the world is very present in my life and my story. And the fact that today I am incredibly blessed and in San Francisco feels like an incredible series of miracles that I am both grateful for, but also feel a responsibility to remember that honestly, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And this, my life should have and could have been statistically very different than it is right now.
You're absolutely right. I think we're at this, we're at a moment in our history, as both Jewish women, that we can feel, I think, incredible empathy for our Jewish sisterhood that is both in the Ukraine, who need our help, and all over Israel. And I would also say in so many different places of the world. I think we as American Jews often feel immune. I think it's a naive feeling of immunity, right? That how could anti-Semitism or how could an attack on our Jewishness actually impact us? Because there is this sense of security that we have. But for me, I think, as a practicing, Jewish woman, who, I am a Sephardim, grew up in, San Antonio, Texas, again, not Eastern European, my family came to this part of the world, escaping the Spanish Inquisition. And came through Mexico, living 400 years or so in Mexico, and then, through Texas. The thing that I think today, though, is that we have lived so long without the threat of, or at least I think this naive thought that anti-Semitism didn't exist here, that we could go to our synagogues, that we could go and we could be outwardly Jewish, and not feel retribution to it. And there's something right now in this time, that while I appreciate I think there's two oceans that protect us, but it hasn't in a world that is filled with misinformation, disinformation. And it seems like the things that we heard about in Hebrew school or read about, or to your point, your grandparents lived, through real anti-Semitic acts during the wars, have seemed to surface here in a way that's very tangible.
I completely agree. And there are people like me who are first generation or second generation from, Europe, who feel it very deeply because my grandparents, my father was born in Uzbekistan because they were fleeing from the Nazis, as Jews, and most of their family, they couldn't take most of their family with them. And so most of the family perished in Ukraine. There are people like me here who remember and who have those stories in our, recent memory.
Yeah.
However, I do think there's a piece of this that's for the broader world, which is that someone mentioned this to me. He said, Jews are actually the most resilient group against genocide because in many cases, genocides were actually successful against groups. Like people who have been targeted for genocide over and over and over again, right? By the Egyptians, by the Romans, by the Nazis, yeah. Right? By the regimes like in Iran and the Spanish Inquisition, right? Like a group has been targeted over and over and over. The chances that we are still alive and here, again, those chances are not great. So there are two ways to look at this, I think, which is as a narrative of victimhood, and this keeps happening to the Jews, or as a narrative of a particular moment in human history, which says that there's a level of consciousness that has collapsed in the world. And when the world becomes unconscious, and we have things like the Middle Ages and the terrible Spanish Inquisition. I'm going to be going to Barcelona and Girona in a few weeks to visit, a lot of those ancient Jewish sites, especially in Girona, which were so much the seat of the awfulness of the Spanish Inquisition. But when you have a group that, is targeted at these moments when the world becomes unconscious, is that a signal for us to wake up? Is the times when these things flare up, and especially persecution of any group, but especially a group that continues to survive in diaspora and continues to flee and just keep surviving, right? Yeah. Is that a moment for us as the global population, Jews and non-Jews and wherever we are, to say, why is this happening again? And what does this mean in terms of the level of consciousness? Because if we have not learned about this particular experience from the past and we're falling into this behavior again, is this a trigger for us as humanity to be asking better questions about where we are, how we got here, and how do we turn our consciousness around, and how do we raise the level of consciousness right now in the global human experience? And that's how I kind of choose to interpret this, which is when we see so much destruction, is the collapse meant to wake us up that there is something terribly wrong with how we've been constructing the world, how we've been designing the world, and now is the moment that we're seeing this collapse, and now is the time to interpret this as an opportunity to rebuild and to redesign.
Absolutely. I think it's a call to re-innovate and to actually start to think about all the things that maybe we had traded off, that we probably shouldn't have. And, as a fan of Bucky Fuller, who once really said, in that space that said, you can either try to save the collapse or build something new right next to it. And there's a part of me that, wonders in our very technology driven world, particularly one that you and I have had a pretty big hand in crafting. Mm-hmm. How much of that plays a role into the space that we're living in today, and the leaders that we choose, in this next, in this next tranche of deciding who our leaders are going to be, whether it's an election, a board member, like all of these things are so inherently linked, and we don't ever think of them as intentional choices because what we expect is an outcome, right?
Yeah. And leadership. So here's the reality is leaders are only leaders because there are followers. So who you elect and select to join, to follow, and to support is extremely meaningful. No matter what level you're at, obviously, if you're a board director, you have more power in many cases to select who the leaders are or the leader of a particular organization is. However, if you're an employee, you may feel that you are constrained in terms of your financial opportunities, but there are certainly ways, right, that you can, even within your organization, elect and select which leaders you support and follow.
Picture a place where design and visionary leadership converge, influencing everything from government to the vast reaches of space. Welcome to Designed By, with me, Joanna Peña-Bickley, for chats with leaders who use the power of design to forge better futures. Don't leave life to chance. Open up your podcast app, search for Designed By with Joanna Peña-Bickley, then crush that follow button to build a better future for everyone, everywhere, every single day.
it's all about leadership, right? Like systems don't actually make decisions. Systems constrain decisions.
Right.
They sometimes over-determine decisions, but leaders make decisions, and good leaders know how to recraft and reshape systems so that new possibilities can emerge, right? Too many people are managers, right? The whole manager versus leaders, right?
Yeah.
Managers manage within the current system and the current structure, and they usually try to think about how do they get promoted within a particular career ladder. Whereas leaders lead the way, right? They actually go off and they're like, there is no ladder here. There's just a higher platform. So how are we going to get there? Right? They trailblaze the way and they're incredibly creative. And so again, instead of thinking that we are constrained within the system, we can unconstrain ourselves by electing and selecting leaders who see things in different ways and who are unapologetically courageous when they question what is happening and they try to bring people to that next higher jump. Now, these leaders are often called demanding and sometimes abrasive by the people who are, climbing the ladder, right? Because
certainly if they're women, those absolutely get put on to women, I think more so than we do our male counterparts, right?
Absolutely. Like, I've never heard Elon Musk be called abrasive, for example. Even though, I mean, come on, right?
Right.
But, but again, find those, especially those female leaders, because this is the other thing that we need to understand is right now, there's also a calling for us to put aside a notion of leadership as just kind of this like feminine macho guy, who takes over the world, or masculine, macho guy, and lean more into, and again, this could be in a male trait or a female trait, but more of a feminine type of holding the space for others to also rise. Yeah. Right. And so one of the best leadership books ever written, is Yertle the Turtle. Have you read Yertle the Turtle?
I have not read that.
Oh my God. It is absolutely worth reading. And, Yertle, the turtle, was king of the pond. And so, and it is all about how leaders, a certain archetype of leader who tries to rise to the top. And rising to the top means, of course, there are people on the bottom. Mm-hmm. But then there's another type of leadership that is holding people and all kind of coming up together. Right now, Yertle the turtle is actually like the leader is toppled by somebody at the bottom. Sure. So it's more of a revolutionary story. But I also interpret it as another possibility where what if you had, your ta instead of your tool? And she lifts people up with her as a leader. And that's the kind of, again, that mentality of holding the community as the whole community rises is the thing that we need out of our leaders today.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things that I've always admired about your story, and where you've come from is that, you have been an inventor, an entrepreneur, a creator, but you have done so with a anchor in human history in a way that nobody that I know thinks about things. Can you tell me a little bit about how some of that thinking, right, has brought you to that next stage in your journey? You went from, obviously being first generation, where does I always look at that. There's the personal, but so much of the personal always leads to whatever the professional ends up becoming. Tell me a little bit about that blend of from the time that you go to school into that first role where, I always think, we are usually those we're born entrepreneurs, inventors, designers, and those creators. Mm-hmm. But I certainly didn't in my personal journey, didn't realize it till I was way down in the journey. I always thought it was like this one thing versus like, no, you can do many things and you could do it really well. How about you?
Well, let me just back up and say that like my journey starts with like my whole family are engineers. So my mother's an engineer, my father's an engineer, my aunt's an engineer, my grandmother's an engineer, my brother's an engineer. And so I was, of course, going to become an engineer. Now we have different types of, we have, my aunt's a civic engineer. My grandmother was a very high level, like manager, top engineer in the Soviet Union, like very, like CTO level, person. My mother's a mechanical engineer. My father's an electrical engineer, but they all loved like problem solving different things. And so I grew up in a very kind of, you can solve any problem, like everybody. And it was also obviously because everybody, the men and the women, and there was no question about women working or not. Of course, women, like there was not even a thing. And so it was a very kind of egalitarian upbringing in that way. And I was the black sheep of the family because I liked humans more than I liked machines. Or studying humans more than I like studying machines. And so my parents kind of thought that was probably going to be okay if I became a lawyer. Like, if you don't want to be an engineer, at least become a lawyer, right? Because they kind of, it's like, the immigrant thing. You can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be an engineer. Those are your three,
And the last one is you do not depress the family story here. Right? Don't disappoint us.
Exactly.
That's the last choice. Yeah.
Yes. But I really like social sciences. I really, really like social sciences. Fortunately, I found economics where I did a lot of math, at least like lots of calculus, lots of math, excelled in that, econometrics. So my first degree actually at Amherst College was economics and econometrics, but I also took some anthropology courses and I also took some Buddhism courses. And to me, it really opened up this panoply of different ways of understanding why humans do the things that they do, and understanding that, again, guess what? Like, nothing builds itself, and machines don't make decisions. Machines don't build themselves. It's all humans making decisions, designing things consciously or unconsciously, because society tells them to design it this way in the background, and they don't even recognize their cultural and social biases. But I was going to become, an investment banker or an economist. And I studied, and I was writing in college in the summertime, a bunch of research papers for the UN on the Russian economic transition. So this was the mid 1990s. And I was writing on the Russian economic transition. And at this time, it was Jeffrey Sachs and Anders Oslund, and everybody was like, yes, Russia will emerge as a great capitalist power, and capitalism is rising up, and the Russians have been freed to be the capitalists that they've always wanted to be. And then 1998 happened and the Russian economy completely collapsed, and all these people were just wrong, like so terribly wrong. Like, all the economic models are wrong. Every single word that I had written for the UN was wrong because I was using purely mathematical economic reasoning to try to explain human behavior. So I had a crisis and I was like, why was I so wrong? Okay. So that crisis, that intellectual crisis of the absolute wrongness of economics, led me to studying more anthropology and studying, well, what is the cultural context that they were trying to do these things in? It's not just math. Humans don't work like mathematical functions. And by the way, mathematical functions only work because human observers have actually set up number sets in a particular way. So even math isn't as objective as the mathematicians think, okay? It's all about the human mind. It's all about the human mind and understanding the context of mental models, decision frameworks, conditions of possibility, and my favorite thing that I learned in anthropology, which is doxa, which are the deep underlying cultural and moral assumptions that people can't even articulate if you were to ask them, those things are actually the most important things in life and in reality. And understanding those things is actually the reason why I've been able to build and shape and manifest many things in the tech world, because most people think that the preconditions are set by the technology or by a particular buying model. But I understand that they're not set. They're all just created inside the human mind, inside the way that we function as a society. And if you start to shift those levers in terms of the narratives that are told, in terms of what we think is possible or impossible within a company, if you have people who can start to knock on those things and show where they are weak and how it can be possibly different, anything is possible. Literally anything. Anything can be moved. Anything can be shaped. Anything can be transformed, and anything can be manifested. And that is where I think great invention comes from. It's understanding that and then applying technology. But when you start with technology, you're not going to get anything truly transformative.
Right. You're absolutely right. What are some of the, one of the things that I love that when you and I first met, you were talking about culture risks and thinking about cultures as almost systems, and how there were these hidden risks to threatening the health of an organization. I think that, some of the work that you were doing, that's actually it seems like all the signals were always there when we talk about the risks of threatening a society, the risks of threatening not just a small company, albeit that's really important. When you think about where we are today, as we are trying to think about, is nation statehood the right thing to be? Is democracy, people are this idea that they would explore the alternatives to democracy. It's interesting because I always found that the work that you did in kind of the 5 hidden risks behind companies are also some of the same risks, maybe applied a little bit more broadly. Can we dive into that? Because that to me was just fascinating.
Yeah. So this was particularly for organizational cultures and how organizational cultures are shaped. And it's really, diving into what are the risks that leaders need to contend with as they're building a corporate culture, and where do things, start going off the rails. I do think one of the interesting ones, it's the first one that I always talk about, is scaling risk, because at a certain point, you start to feel that your systems are no longer adequate to the scale that you're currently at. Scale in the company context is number of people, but it can also be about power, right? So when you and your citizens believe that you are at a particular scale where you're, too powerful to fail, or you don't really need to be trying very hard to succeed anymore, and that you can just kind of fall back on your old systems and not have to redesign for the future, that's a really dangerous point for any organization or any system to be in, because systems need questioning, they need redesign, they need constant kind of re-energizing by people who are stepping back and looking at where are we right now in terms of our level of people, our level of power, and how do we need to move forward given where we are right now. And I think as a society, one of the problems is our mental model. We're living in a kind of 1970s or 1980s mental model of the world. And the world has moved on, but our mental model of the world is still at that 1980s threshold. And we're not adapting. And one of the reasons we're not adapting is because we have a lot of conformity risk, or at least there's conformity in our political, I would say the political party system.
Sure.
Right. Where the machine has kind of operated in the same way again, since the 1980s.
Yeah.
We haven't rethought the primary system. We haven't redesigned the primary system, for example. to really adapt to the polarization that's happened, particularly through social media.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we get down to the election system, right, we've got this conformity that collides with, again, the world actually having moved on. The system has had a lot of conformity in terms of getting people to have to move up this particular, Republican or Democratic ladder. And yet society is having a completely different conversation and is being polarized in a completely different way. But again, there's conformity in the people who are making the decisions and in the leadership. And that's really a problem. So I think those in particular are extremely salient to where we are as a society, and understanding that by not adapting our culture and thinking about it as a system that constantly needs questioning and adaptation and redesign,
Mm-hmm.
we have gotten ourselves in a very significant pickle now, because we're about to have an election where nobody likes either one of the candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, everybody hates both candidates. And our system has no alternative but to have these two people that nobody wants, because it's been set up in this like super conforming way.
I think you're right. And I think I've talked about it as the adaptivity gap, because I actually think a part of it is, our ability to learn. I think so many, whether it was company cultures, I would say even within our corporate systems, I would tell you in our educational systems, we actually have vilified learning and intellectual thought. And wanting to go deeper. And a part of this is, I think, that's driven, and you talked about social media being an attention economy. So, for an attention economy, if 15 seconds is all you're going to get, how much intellectual thought might you actually express? I think the second part of that, and it's an interesting one, I'd really love to get your take on it, has been, we have truly defunded what, innovation used to be about learning. It wasn't just the monetary piece of it, but it was, does this invention actually solve the problem? I always looked at innovation as a hypothesis of what was possible, right? Of the art of the possible, but it ultimately was a hypothesis until it got into your customer's hands. And whether or not it truly solved the problem. But we seem to have gotten away from understanding or waiting for the result and being enamored with the hype of a product, or being enamored with a narrative that these products were all going to solve our lives or make us better connected, when in fact they have disconnected our world so deeply that, if you look at the latest trend on, what is shaping our individual lives, is that people actually feel lonely in a hyper-connected society. And that's got to tell you, we've got this wrong. But I think a part of that journey has been that we have demonized intellectual thought and learning as a part of the process. And we overemphasize the monetary gain that was always a result of that learning.
Yeah. So my question is, why didn't this happen with radio and TV?
Right.
Because the incentives were still the same.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So one of the things that I, again, as an anthropologist and historian, and I used to work in advertising, the people who say that the problem is advertising and social media forget that the only reason we had independent newspapers is because of advertising.
Yeah.
That radio and television were sponsored by advertising from the 1930s to the 1990s. And it worked just fine. And again, that attention economy, it was also an attention economy, right?
Totally.
Ratings is basically just, eyeballs, right? Clicks.
That's right.
So that actually hasn't changed. What's changed is that the leaders in the government are incapable of creating the right guardrails and the right regulations and the right rules of the game for social media that they did create for radio and for TV.
That's right.
We had good leaders in the 1950s, in the 1930s, the 1940s. You can say things about censorship, and maybe they were a little heavy-handed with some censorship, but overall, they did a pretty good job of making sure that you did not make, false claims on TV.
Yeah.
That there were laws, and then that there were laws that a certain amount of the space and a certain amount of the attention needed to be for the public good. And those regulations have just gone away.
Yeah, they've evaporated.
Our leaders are so bad, and they're so out of touch. And it's not a party thing. Both parties, right, are like terrible. In fact, I do have to say, like, the one candidate who seems to actually get it is Nikki Haley, but she can't talk too much about it because she's so like outside the norm. And, because she's being honest about TikTok when she's asked directly, because she gets it. And, again, then people just like dunk on her, like as if she doesn't know what's going on. Whereas in fact, she seems to. Anyway, this is about her.
It's interesting that you say that. I find that we actually have two female candidates. I look at, our current vice president, who, by the way, was a legislator over Silicon Valley, is deeply immersed in these things. But what the system doesn't seem to be producing, to your point, is regulation. And I think that so much of, you can blame law piece, you can blame this. I cannot, the point of blame, like that time is over. To actually have laws that have teeth in them. To your point about television and radio, there were consequences to saying lies on television.
Yes, there were
consequences to you saying things that were out of, not just out, it wasn't necessarily out of the norm, particularly in radio. I can remember days when, in the days of Howard Stern, when he was purely on terrestrial radio, right, that there were bars that, yes, he'd cross, but there were consequences to him crossing that, whether it was monetary, you talk about FCC licensing, and you were held accountable, whether it was the company or you as the broadcaster. And today there is a false narrative that seems to be in our space being led by regulation is a stifler to innovation. And as a designer, I went, come on. That's a constraint. It's not a stifling. If you're really smart, right? Really smart, creative people work within constraints.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. And we had, again, through the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, we had great television emerge. And we had fantastic advertising. That people still remember, right? Like the jingles from our childhood.
Totally.
They were fun, and okay, maybe they should have also regulated the sugar content in cereal or whatever, maybe. But the point is that it's not the attention economy isn't the problem. The advertising isn't the problem. The problem, and the reason it's a new problem, is because the people who are supposed to be creating the rules of the game have given up.
That's right.
They're given up. And by and large, they're fairly corrupt. And that's why you have people just saying, let's throw out democracy. Because honestly, I don't think people are whenever the explanation is, people are just like stupid, I'm like, well, there's a deeper explanation there. So the question is, why are people actually advocating to end democracy? Because they don't see a way out of the corruption. They don't see a way out of the dysfunction in the current system. And the current system we have labeled democracy. But again, it's very far from the democracy that we need.
Yeah.
And I think that it's up to us to elect and select the leaders that we, we know this, right? But then the question is, like, again, we're going to be faced in a couple of months with this impossible choice and everybody's going to hold their nose.
Yeah.
And we don't know how it's going to end up.
Yeah. I look at it in this and I say, it's up to us to actually, we as societies tend to, we do get the leaders we tend to deserve. I don't know if we ever deserved the last leader that we just had, on any grand scale, but the fact that those are the only two choices, I think is a challenge for us to work, on the mechanisms that actually produce this choice.
Right.
And for me, I look at it and say, we're not looking at two of the same thing at all.
That's true.
Right. We're not you can't,
definitely, but I understand why some people are like, we just need to like throw it all out and start from scratch with this crazy guy. What they maybe don't realize is that crazy guy is anyway, like,
crazy,
work for you.
He's not working for you. And I think one of the things that we've got to do is actually go back to this idea around, there's politics. I always say there's a mental model to politics and there's a mental model to public service. Mm-hmm. And what we are looking for, right, is the empathetic public servant, right, who has the ability and the fortitude to create. The reason we send them to, whether it is your state capitals or to the mayoral race that you might be, because all of these decisions are important, sometimes even more important at a local level than even the national ones are. But since, we're here in America and it's an election year for the presidency, and also for our Senate and our Congress, at this point, we have to decide the mechanisms that need to be fixed actually need hands that want to fix it, as opposed to be the next TikTok story.
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me is that the world seems to be pretty massively shifting and falling apart at the same time that we have this incredible set of coincidences that came together to create artificial intelligence, like real artificial intelligence.
Right.
And again, when there are so many coincidences happening at the same time, I'm like, is there something deeper in the system that's actually causing this seeming confluence of coincidences? And I often say this as a joke, but it's kind of not a joke, which is, what if we start to create the new guardrail to be AI? Like, leaders need to go to AI. AI gives a set of options about what are good solutions given, the reward function of doing what's best for the nation. Right. As defined by things that I think we can agree on, economic well-being, safety, right? Both inside the country and outside the country. And AI gives a particular set of choices. So, I mean, Palantir is doing this on the battlefield, right? They've got AI now suggesting battle plans to generals, and generals supposedly choose between them, although we don't know how much longer that's going to continue. But that's what they have demoed or talked about, at least. But why not do that for the government?
Right.
Why is it that we have this incredible we have more data on all of the things that we care about than we've ever had before.
Yeah.
And still making decisions by, old people in their offices and their staff reading, 2,000 staff.
Right. As opposed to referring to a corpus of data, right? As opposed to referring to AI that is trained on a corpus of information. And what it becomes real decision management.
Yeah.
At its core.
My alternative is AI for president. Let's have like a third party candidate.
Yeah.
Which is an AI model that takes in all the data. We agree, right? Like, based on again, things that we agree the government is for.
That's right.
Like public safety, national security, and economic well-being. And then have AI decide, like, what are the possibilities?
Yeah.
Like that's my solution, because why are we not using the most powerful tool that we have that is here? Like it's like literally emerged for this moment right now when we can't get ourselves out of this pickle.
Yeah.
And we're not even thinking about using it.
Well, and I think the part of we're thinking about using it, and this is, I think, a really important one. I don't think that much of a shift as we think about it. AI for president, I might be with you there, is that I actually think that we have such a barrier that, again, in the polarized narrative, it's either really good or it's really bad. It's either the end of the world, right? Thank you, Elon and team. I always, question the motives behind narratives like that, which is, you mean you need time to catch up? And it's really bad, right? Or it's really good, right? You're so enthusiastic about it that it has solved, it's solved world hunger. And the answer is it probably could at this time.
It won't.
But it won't. And the reason it won't is because what we are not doing is actually bringing people AI literacy. I think you and I come from a fortunate place that we've worked in it for a long time. AI isn't new. It's been a 50+ year journey to get us to where we are now. And there's been a tremendous amount of learning. The zeitgeist, though, is we actually need more people utilizing it, because I think that we would actually foundationally get better decisions from people, much more informed decisions, as opposed to a part of the narrative of why not to use it is it's bias. Well, let's start with, how do you know it's bias? What data was it trained on? And so to your point around, I actually think that we have a data problem, and the data problem is actually solved by the AI, which brings us wisdom. I think that we are bloated, like we're overweight with data. We have produced so much data, we don't know what to do with it. And yet AI is here as the perfect refining machine to help us deliver on the wisdom we need to make the right decisions. And yet we're not using it that way.
We're not using it that way. And it's, I, for one, am more than happy. I live in San Francisco, and I am more than happy to replace the entire San Francisco Board of Supervisors with an AI, because they are the worst, most corrupt group of people.
Yeah.
Like, they're in it for themselves. They're super financially corrupt. They're morally corrupt. They have no moral basis. They don't care at all what happens to the city. And we're taxed more per capita than any other group of people like in the country.
Yeah.
And we have no public services. Everybody knows what's going on in San Francisco. And the supervisors are making money hand over fist, through their corruption. And so, I don't know why we don't start with a city like San Francisco that everybody knows is incredibly broken, and just be like, we're getting rid of the Board of Supervisors. We're putting in an AI, and that's how we're going to run the city. It's that you have institutions that have so much conformity, that have not, scaled their ideas with the scale of their power and the scale of their complexity, right? The scale of power and complexity has just shot up, right, in the last 30 years. And our leaders have not kept up. They have not redesigned our systems. They've not even thought about or scenario planned how anything is going to be transforming. And we have a lack. The other one is, innovation risk, right? That we stop innovating because we just literally don't know what to do. So with the subway, it's the age old product manager's problem, which is the engineers are telling you have to rip everything out and replatform everything from scratch and stop the subway for 2 years in order to build a new system. And then you're like, we can't, that's infeasible because we have millions of people using it every day. So we can't replatform it. And we're taking all of our resources just to keep it running today. So it's the age old product manager problem of, what do you do when your technology is outdated, but you don't have the resources or the time to both replatform and to build the new thing?
Yeah.
To replatform and build the new thing and continue to serve your current customers day to day at the same time. It's just, and we have this now at such a scale that human leaders that we can elect, again, through these antiquated institutions, are not up to the job.
Wow, that final thought, that human leaders are not up for the job, just, because this is really
it's a truth. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. We have, on a national basis, a Congress that has yet to prioritize nonpartisanship to protect the people of the United States' data. And I think sometimes we think about data as not a big deal, but we as consumers need to understand our identity is data. And we are at such great risk because our national leaders, our state, and now our local leaders, right? If those are the leaders that we have elected to help us navigate not an increasingly digital world, an AI intelligence first world, I have to agree some of them aren't to the task. They haven't proven that they can be the leaders that we need them to be in terms of producing laws. Their job is to understand the society and produce laws that protect that society.
It really wasn't ever this forefront thought until they started to be concerned with how it affects them on a voter scale, because now with AI and with digital media, things are a lot more accessible and harder to trace back when it comes to finding the real thing. And I do have to agree with her in the sense of just like her views on AI replacing corrupt politicians and how the institution of power and complexity is not keeping up with modern technology. And it kind of just feels like sometimes they don't want to, especially when you see them interact with tech companies and they ask very silly and exposing questions for them.
Well, and here's the silliness. And I have to go back to the days of President Obama, who I adore, who I think was a monumental leader. But one of the mistakes that he made, right, was thinking that the tech companies would be government's friends. When in fact, what we were really doing, right? And look, our job as capitalists, as entrepreneurs in technology, as inventors, is to get as many people using our technologies as possible. And that was our only focus. Government's role, right, was supposed to be put the guardrails in place ahead of these innovations, which, by the way, are government innovations. The internet comes out of DARPA. You look at things like VR, they come out of DARPA being the Defense Department's, originating of Innovation Lab. You look at artificial intelligence, once again, something that the U.S. government actually funded in the 50s. Our legislators who are in charge of these systems should know better. And what seems to me is today we have a bunch of TikTok artists as legislators who are not doing the hard work of educating their public as to the pros and cons. It's not all dystopia and it's not all utopia. Yeah. As truth lies, and I think one of the things she talked about, and you've touched on it for me, and was a bit of an eye-opener. I'm not of the ilk to replace humans. That hasn't ever been my perspective. Now, there is some perspective that is so frustrated with the system that says out with the old and in with something that could replace them.
She said it in the episode, but leaders are only leaders because there are followers. And I do appreciate Tatyana bringing a more anthropological approach to the discussion and giving us a totally different perspective on politics, but just also society. Because while I might have a different approach to what I want the future is, I can also appreciate through her lived experience why she has hers.
Oh, totally agree with you. Look, I think one of the things about our civil discourse today is sometimes not appreciating other people's lived experiences or that one is better than the other.
Exactly.
I appreciate that you're appreciative of that aspect of her leadership because in the short time that we had together, it was a really refreshing reminder that it is so important just to listen and to take in and not to push down things you disagree with.
So, on that note, let's read us out.
This episode was written and produced by the AI Design Corps at Aurora 21 in the heart of New York's magical Hudson Valley. Special thanks to the musical talents of Rachel Bickley, our podcast sound designer. Our theme music was composed by Substance Studios. If you're already following the show, you're well on your way to designing a better future. If not, what are you waiting for? It's time to join the magic. Go to your favorite podcast service and search Designed By with Joanna Peña-Bickley and hit follow.
Design the future.